Right. Welcome everybody to the next in our series of webinars about the Digimap collections. Today we're going to be looking at Global Digimap, and I'd like to welcome our guest speaker, Seraphim Alvanides, who's from the University of Newcastle at Northumbria. Seraphim is a social geographer. I think that's the term you use, isn't it, Seraphim? Who looks at analysis of large spatial data sets relating to urban sprawl and active transport and linguistic landscapes, which is a new term for me. Today, he's going to be talking to us about the spatiotemporal changes to street names in Leipzig, East Germany. This is going to be very interesting. We're going to talk about using Digimap, using the data from Global Digimap. So let's move. Oh no, one thing I was going to say is that we will concentrate on questions for Seraphim first, since we are very grateful for his time today. If there are questions about Digimap, we will put those secondary because we can always answer those by email or on the phone later on. So we'll just concentrate on making the best use of Seraphim's time while we have him here. So I'd like to say thank you to Seraphim for his time today. It's very much appreciated, and say that it's time to hand over to you. Oh, no, one more thing. We'll go through Seraphim's talk, and then if we have time afterwards, Viv, my colleague, will do a quick demonstration of Global Digimap and various bits and pieces that we should highlight in case you've missed them.
Okay, so thank you for the invitation. I'm based at Northumbria University in Newcastle, and I will be talking about the street name changes in Eastern Germany, but focusing in a specific city in Leipzig. And I will also make reference to another city in Poland, and the city is Poznan. But the obvious question is, why are we interested in street name changes? Now, it is part of what we call the linguistic landscapes kind of strand of research, as well as critical toponymy in geography. So civic linguistic acts of renaming streets or bridges or other toponyms demonstrate and contribute to the end of a certain era and the beginning of a new era. So there's a whole bibliography around this concept of renaming urban features, why they're being renamed, how they're being renamed, the processes behind them, and of course, the ideologies that usually surround them. And street names in particular are quite interesting because they have this kind of subversive element. We use them every day, all day. We don't really pay too much attention to what street names actually mean or what they represent, yet they are part of our everyday lives. And in some cases, it can be things like, names or flowers or birds. But in other cases, it can be quite controversial issues. Not so much in the UK, although there are examples of that, but in other places, especially in Europe or in countries with succession of political transitions and changes, you can see that street names are quite sensitive topics. So street names, to a certain extent, represent what we call the ideological robe of the city in linguistic landscape research. And we can also use them as a measurement of political change. And you will see how we're doing this in the examples that I'm going to show you today. Now, as I mentioned, this is part of a much larger project looking at the linguistic landscape of street names in Eastern Germany and Poland. The project is called MIL. And it's focusing on 6 towns and cities. You can see 4 of them here: Leipzig, which is what I'm going to talk about today; Poznan, which I'm hoping to demonstrate a little bit on; and then Frankfurt oder and Skubice, which we are currently researching. I will not focus too much on how we collected the data and how exactly we analyzed it, etc., but I'm going to show you some of the results so that you can see the value of using maps, of using geographical data, as well as what it all means in practice. Now, what you need to be aware to understand this presentation is the general kind of political changes in Germany, which obviously influence the rest of Europe as well. And some key dates: 1918 onwards, the end of the First World War and the democracy being established in Germany. Then we have the 1933 is the establishment of the Nazi government. 1994 is kind of the post war era and the USSR establishment and kind of ruling parts of Germany in the eastern part. And then we have 1989, the end of the Cold War and the establishment of parliamentary democracy in the eastern part of Germany. And Leipzig happens to be on the eastern part, and this is why it's of interest to this research. Now, focusing on Leipzig, we use the 2019 version of the OpenStreetMap, and this was downloaded from Digimap, and this is the reason why I'm giving you the talk today. I could have used other sources of downloading the data, but it will become evident why I used Digimap Global for the data. And this consisted of 2,150 unique street names in the Leipzig area. We entered the data into a spreadsheet, and then we created around 102 columns to code the data from 1916 to 2018. Now, obviously, we started from 2019, and we kind of worked backwards, trying to understand all the street name changes. The changes themselves of the street names came from the Leipzig office for statistics and elections. So we had a database containing the reasons why the street names were renamed, semantics of street names, exact dates, etc. But all this was not in a comprehensive form. Some data was in PDF format, some data was in maps, some was in a kind of more contemporary database. So there was a lot of work behind the scene to code all this information. Additional sources, old maps, city plans, travel guides, archival documents, etc. It's a 3-year project, so quite a few people were involved digging into the data. This resulted in 2,230 street name changes for the city of Leipzig over 102 years, and this is what I'm going to show you today. Now, to understand what sort of changes we're talking about and how we coded them, I have an example here of various street names named in 1944 and then post-war changing their names. And you can see here, of course, an Adolf Hitler Straße, for example, and in May 1945, it was renamed into Hauptstraße. Hauptstraße means the main street. And you have Schlagenstraße, which was actually renamed twice in the same year into different names. So you can see the complexity of this exercise. And in some cases, we have different streets renamed into the same street name because they were merged, for example. And in other cases, we have splits of streets. So a street being renamed, part of it, and another part being named into some other name. Okay, these are the changes I mentioned earlier over 101 years. And all you see here is just the changes, the number of changes by year, so that you can see how we use these street name changes to understand the political changes that happened in Leipzig. So this is Leipzig, the years on the horizontal and the number of changes in the vertical. And we can see here the end of the First World War, and immediately there were some street name changes. The Nazi era, of course, was accompanied by changes of streets into Nazi-related personalities. The end of the Second World War and the denazification of the eastern part of Germany, as well as introducing gradually new names that were representing communist and socialist personalities. And then the Wende, the change, again, the unification and the unified Germany, which then resulted in another kind of swiping of street name changes. So you can see how the politics of the eastern part of Germany are reflected into the street names of the city. Oh, I just talked about all these without the animation. That's fine. Now, some of these changes indicating here, some of these peaks are also in relation to urban expansion. So, of course, the cities, on the one hand, sprawl outwards. On the other hand, we have new buildings and new areas being built up, and this results into new streets being introduced and new street names. And at the same time, we have the annex of neighboring smaller villages or local authorities into the wider area of Leipzig. Leipzig is quite a big city today of more than 500,000 people. So over the years, it annexed different parts of the city. of the outer city. And here we can see a map simply showing the number of changes. So what we see here in different colors is whether a street changed name once, twice, 3 times, etc. And we can see the center of Leipzig around the middle, and the conurbation of Leipzig. This is the main urban area. And what is of interest here is which streets changed more than 3 or 4 times. And you can see it's the main arteries leading into and out of the city. So although the smaller streets and the back streets also changed name, in some cases, we have here 1,358 changes, or streets changed name once. We have some of these major arteries changing 4, 5, or 7 times. Why? Because, of course, these are the streets that people identify with or associate with, or they are main streets into and out of the city. And when we talk about politics, the politicians or the local actors want to make a big statement about what the city represents. Okay, moving on to new namings or renamings. That's another way of looking at the data. So we have the introduction of names or renaming of existing streets. And I'm not going to go into detail with this because I want to show you the more important graphs, which are about the ideological changes. So we can see here that depending on how we split the data set, we can focus on renamings and the reasons behind these streets were renamed or new names introduced. And these have different kind of theoretical approaches. Okay, and these again represent the different eras. But moving on, I wanted to explain a little bit how we went about classifying the ideology of the street name changes. So we have here what we call the outcome of a street name change. Is it infusing new ideology, or is it not infusing new ideology? So is a new name ideologically linked or not? And I have here various examples where the existing, for example, street name is renamed with another, with an ideological name. And this can result in change of ideology, for example, or the existing street renamed with an ideological name, but becoming kind of non-ideological as an outcome. I have here various examples where we can take a look. For example, we have here Paul von Hindenburg. He was a military general, the second president of Germany, but he played some role in the Nazi seizure of power in 1933, and he was partly responsible for appointing Hitler as Chancellor of Germany. So there was no way that this name would remain there in later years. And in later years, this street was changed into Friedrich Ebertstrasse, who was a politician of the Social Democratic Party and the first president of Germany. So we can see there political change of a street name, which introduces a new ideology or results in a new ideology. And of course, we have something like Adolf Hitler's Strasse, very heavily politically charged, which becomes something non-ideological, which is a Südstrasse. Now, the process behind the street name change is, of course, ideological. We want to denazify the city, but the outcome is the removal rather than an introduction of ideology. And this is where it becomes then interesting to look at how the different political systems and actors change the ideological robe of the city. So we split the street name changes on non-ideological outcomes and ideological outcomes, and they're roughly 50-50, okay? But what happens here is the Nazi era, we can see, is introducing ideological change, as well as the end of the Second World War is actually introducing ideological change, while later on, during the GDR years, of course, we have some ideological change happening, but later on, at the change with the unification of Germany, we see a move towards kind of de-ideologizing the linguistic landscape, so removing ideology. And then with the unified Germany, we have a period around 2000 where the changes are 50-50. What does all this look? Oh, sorry, before I move on to that, we need, of course, to make adjustments for the number of years. So what I have done here is I have averaged the ideology and non-ideology by the length of these regimes. And you can see here that during the Nazi period, on average, we had many more, double the number of ideological changes, as well as during this GDR, this very lengthy GDR, the socialist regime period, which is not so evident in this graph. But once we adjust for the number of years that this period lasted, you can see that there was also a lot of ideological change. While during the parliamentary democracy, there's this removal of ideology from the linguistic landscape of the city. When we look at the maps, and this is very interesting again, these are the early changes, and I'll go one back, where mostly we have non-ideological change. So the early years from 1916 to 1932, and you can see the map is dominated by blue. And although there's quite a few red areas, and when we have local knowledge of the city and we try to understand what sort of areas these are, I have put some examples here. So we have here poets, for example, being introduced in the linguistic landscape, mythology from Germany, German mythology introduced in the landscape, and some sort of political statement about these areas that were lost after the First World War through the Treaty of Versailles. And moving on to the next period, the Nazi period is very interesting because we can see mostly red in the linguistic landscape, but also the kind of introduction. We have, of course, Adolf Hitler Strasse and some of the areas around annexation of Austria. Again, the Versailles comes in, military admirals coming into the landscape, German painters and architects to keep in touch with the kind of artistic history of Germany, etc. Moving on to the socialist regime, we can see a lot more red in the linguistic landscape. And what we have here now is changes to of street names into Russian artists and scientists, resistance fighters, German language poets again, Rosa Luxemburg Strasse, of course, the big names in socialist revolution, Karl Liebknecht Strasse, Lenin, Karl Marx. We see all the usual names here from the socialist history. And moving on to the parliamentary democracy, we can see how this de-idealization of the city to a certain extent is reflected on the map, as well as the changes of the big arteries into less ideological names. This is a kind of summary about what happened in the streets by different periods, but this is basically summarizing what we saw on the maps. Now I want to show you a little bit more because we saw how what happened in Leipzig. In Poznan, I will try and show you a different way of looking at this. And this is why I wanted to download OpenStreetMap data. It is not enough to do the analysis. We also want to communicate this with the public. So at the moment, I'm working on interfaces to present the data and make it widely available. Okay, let's see if this works. First of all, I'm going to stop sharing for a second. And then start sharing again, I guess. A different screen. Okay. Now, hopefully you can see what's happening here. And this is now an interactive tool where I'm presenting the data for Poznan, the Polish city. And you can see here we have many more street name changes, totaling 4,403 over the course of the years. But many of them, this is an interesting one, 520 of them are translations because Poznan was under occupation by the Germans. So there was a translation of street names, not necessarily change per se, simply a translation into German and then back into Polish. And we can see the periods where this happened here. in 1938-40 and then 46-48. Moving on to non-ideological and ideological changes, we have to take into account the translations, and we can see again the peaks here and the many more ideological changes during the periods 38-40 and 46-48, and then again more recently non-ideological changes in 86-88. When we try to do an adjustment again by period, what we need to have in mind is that the periods for Poland are slightly different to well, quite a lot different to the periods for Germany. So it makes sense to have, for example, 9 periods for the history of Poland. And you can see how these are reflected here, taking into account the length of these periods. I'm not going to go into the detail of how these periods have been selected, but I wanted to show you the difference here. If we adopt the German periodization, or if we change them to take into account the fact that, for example, the Polish, Poland didn't experience the Nazi regime at exactly the same years, but a little bit later. So you can see here the effect is quite high of the ideological changes in Poznan, but it becomes even higher, 110 changes on average on the street names during the Nazi period and the Nazi occupation of Poznan. And then, of course, we can also split it by namings and renamings, etc. I have also prepared online maps, which hopefully you will be able to see here. And the idea, I'm not going to show you this, I'm going to show you the ideological change. And the idea here is we can switch on and off online the changes in ideology for Poznan. So we see here the city, the static maps I showed you earlier for Leipzig are now dynamic for Poznan, and you can see all the changes. And the reason why we're using OpenStreetMap data is that it's public domain and then available for reuse and republication online. So this online tool is going to be used for educating the public about these street name changes. Now, one final comment I wanted to make. I will again stop sharing the screen and share it and go back to my presentation, hopefully. Okay, I'm wrapping up here, but I mentioned, now hopefully you can see this, even if it's not, okay, it's presentational. There is another, 2 smaller cities, they're actually towns, Frankfurt Oder on the German slide and Słubice on the Polish side. And here we have this interesting methodological problem. This is taken from the Global Digimap map, and the boundary between the countries is not actually very accurate here. The boundary is the Oder River, and you can see here the 2 cities. And the methodological problem is that Słubice was part of Germany for quite a few years. So if I was to download the data from other tools and platforms where I define the area, for example, by country or by region, it would be very difficult then to merge this information. So this is one extra reason why I'm downloading the data from Digimap's global map, because I can specify a rectangle or any polygon and then be able to download data for these 2 towns, although they belong to different countries. And this is currently under research. This is the last case study that we will be working on, looking at the changes in street names between Frankfurt and Słubice. Now, it's less challenging because they are smaller places. It's more challenging because the boundary, this boundary here, the German-Polish boundary, kept moving back and forth over the years. And it will be very interesting to see how this was reflected in the street names. Okay, in conclusion, this research was focusing on the urban city text from a linguistic landscape research perspective, but also from a geovisualization and spatial analysis perspective. Linguistic landscape, which you mentioned earlier, it's a new term, is actually an area of research that is very interesting for geographers and critical geographers in particular, because it's about how language is depicted in our everyday life in space. And the focus here was on quantification as well as on critical toponymy, and we took this longitudinal analysis perspective, which is quite innovative. There are quite a few studies around street names, but they tend to be case studies of very small geographical areas, or very big studies using, let's say, secondary data, but not drilling into what it actually means, or taking a longitudinal perspective. And the further research is a special patterning of the ideological and non-ideological street names. And this means then doing space syntax and other forms of geographical analysis. And finally, I would like to thank my colleagues, the principal investigators for this project, based in Germany, Professor Isabel Buchstaller and Professor Małgorzata Fabyczak from Poland. And that's all from me. Thank you. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now, and I'm happy to answer questions if we have time.
Thank you, Seraphim. That was fascinating. It's quite amazing how frequently names change like that just in one city. I suppose some of these places have been through huge amounts of other change. We do have some time for a few questions. We've got, I have one question, but we'll come to my question a bit later. Let's ask our audience first. Viv, are you there? Shall I read the first one and we'll go through it like we did last time?
Yeah, absolutely.
Great. Okay, so Seraphim, my first question is, are there any specifically Sorb or Wend names in Eastern Germany?
Sorry, I didn't understand this. What names?
Can you see the, it's probably easier if you can see the chat and then you can read the question
yes,
as well.
Sorry.
Just in case my pronunciation is completely...
Sorb or Wend? What does that mean? Sorb or Wend? I'm not sure.
Can Peter, can you enlighten us and maybe expand on your question a little bit? In the meantime, maybe while he does that, I'll come to my question, if that's okay.
Okay.
Do you know how widely available the street name change data is for other places? And it sounds to me as though you've been quite lucky to have this particular data set for Leipzig. This would be fascinating research to do in all sorts of places, but I don't know how common it is for that information to be recorded.
I mean, the major finding from this project that we learned is we started a little bit naively thinking that the data would be widely available and easy to download, or we would be able to somehow harvest it online. But in reality, it means visiting every city, talking to the people there, drilling into the archives. So the information is there, but city by city, it's always to be found in different places, sometimes in the libraries, sometimes in the archives, sometimes in the statistical office. And it's quite well documented, but not always at the same place and not always consistently documented.
Yeah, I can imagine that. I suspect that the historical aspect of doing this would be fascinating as well. I can imagine the whole England-Scotland thing going back 1,000 years might be quite interesting to fewer streets maybe, but I doubt very much that information exists. We have some clarification on our original question. Sorbs are a Slavic minority in Saxony, and Wend is another name for Slavic minorities living close to German settlements.
Oh, thank you for the clarification. Now, I am not a scholar of the languages, but I will pass on this question to my colleagues who are the linguists and the discourse analysts and the history experts. So
lovely, thank you.
I don't know the answer to this. I'm sorry.
Peter, we will endeavour to get an answer and see if we can send it with the transcript of this webinar, and hope we can find an answer for you. Do we have any other questions?
I have a question. I wondered, Seraphim, is it quite novel for a social geographer like you to work with linguists on this kind of project? You know, the maps really bring it to life. So I just wondered, is this quite a new thing to work in that multidisciplinary way?
Yeah, as I mentioned, there are a few people looking at street name changes and classifying, etc. And it tends to be kind of either broad studies of, we're going to use some sort of artificial intelligence tool to classify streets for 50 cities. and not real collaboration between linguists and what these names mean, etc. Or on the other side, there's a lot of qualitative ethnographic research looking at drilling down into a single street, for example. So this kind of collaboration between linguists, historians, and myself as a geographer is quite a unique collaboration, and we learned a lot, but it came with certain challenges. We see the world in completely different ways, actually. I see the world as maps, and then some people see it as spreadsheets or as text or as, you know, historical documents. So it was very interesting. But thank God we had 3 years to work on this, because if it was a shorter project, it would be even more of a challenge.
Yeah, clearly
fascinating results.
Fantastic. Viv, I don't think we've got any more questions for now. Do you want to move on to do a demonstration?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll just do a quick demo.
Great, thank you.
Of Global Digimap. Okay, so Emma, Seraphim, please feel free just to jump in if there's any features that you think are useful to point out that I'm not pointing out. I'm just going to make that full screen. Okay, so for those of you that haven't used our Global Digimap service, we've got 2 applications. Global Roam, where you can browse the global maps that we have and use various tools to measure, add overlays and so on. And then you can print those out as a PDF or as an image. And then the Global Data Download is the application that Seraphim has used to download the OpenStreetMap data for his particular project area or areas. So I'll give you a quick look at Global Roam, and there's a few features I think might be useful for you. But again, Emma, if there's anything you think I'm missing, do shout. So when you open up Global Roam, what you're viewing is this natural Earth data set. This is a community data set, and it's a very small scale data set. I think it was created as people felt there was a lack of openly available small scale global data. So this one is from June 2018. If I click on the base maps, I can then switch to the world panorama from Collins Bartholomew. So this is a world political map, and it's based on the same source data as the Times Atlas of the World. So if I just zoom in, I want to zoom on Beijing, but I think I've lost the plot here. Let's just zoom in on China, and you can see the kind of level of detail that's available there. If I select the map content, you'll see that there is a legend available for this. Now I'm going to search for Beijing because I want to zoom in and show you the switch to the OpenStreetMap data. Okay, so this is zoomed into the center of Beijing, and I want to show you the overlays that we have. We have this world place name overlay found in this overlays panel on the right, and I just thought it was quite useful to point that out. If you're working in countries that don't have Roman characters for place names, you can turn this layer on and view those. And I'll just zoom in as far as I can to show you the kind of level that you get on the OpenStreetMap data. Like the natural Earth data, I reckon this is Tiananmen Square here and the whatever you call the main palace there. The OpenStreetMap data, like the natural Earth data, is a community sourced data set, and it's straightforward to use that in various different ways. So that is our OpenStreetMap data, and again in the map content you can choose to switch the different layers on and off. So if you don't wish to see paths and tracks, for example, you can just select which layers you wish to view. Now I'll go back out to the map of the world and just show you the other overlay. We've got 2 there, world place names and the World Life Fund for Nature world biomes. Those are a fairly recent addition to the service. So if you're working in physical geography, these may be useful to you. Another tool you can use to work with these is this little information tool at the top here. Just turn that on and then select any biome, and it will give you the attributes for that data. So this is deserts and xeric shrublands I'm looking at there. The other 2 features I wanted to show you were how you can combine, I'm going to turn that off now, where how you can combine perhaps your own data or data from other sources, how you can integrate those into Global Roam. So there's two ways to do that. Within the overlays menu here, there are two tabs. So I'm on the Digimap one, these are the overlays we provide, but there's also a web map service tab. So in here, you can add in a web map service from another data provider. You can actually also add in the other Digimap collections into here as well. So if I was working in Britain, I could combine the OpenStreetMap data, for example, with geological data. But because it's Global Digimap, I found a web map service which was for global bathymetry. So I'm just going to turn that on, and hopefully you should see a difference in the map. These can be a little slow to load sometimes. But if you do find a web map service from a different provider that would work well in combination with our data sets, this is a really useful tool. So it's added that in. I'm just going to fade out our world panorama data using this little slider bar at the top. And if I just zoom in on the Gulf of Mexico, for example, you can see that there is some additional bathymetry data that's been added in there. Again, it's taking a little while to load, so I'll move on from that. But that gives you the principle that you can bring in web map services from other providers. And there's one other way to bring your own data in. Within the drawing tool menu on the left, we have you can create drawings. So if you want to add markers, polygons, lines, and so on, that's available there. But there is an import tab as well. So if you have any geospatially referenced data, whether it be in a shapefile, Google Earth, GPX tracks, even in a spreadsheet, you can import those into the Roam service. So I'm going to say choose file, and my colleague gave me a shapefile of global volcanoes earlier. So it's uploaded my zip file, and I just say import, and I'm going to say replace annotations because I'm not interested in those markers particularly. And once this is uploaded, it'll upload a point for each of the volcanoes that are in this file.
Worth saying, Viv, as well, that with the third-party WMS feeds that you bring in, sometimes, as you were showing there, they can be a little bit slow. People often think that this is Digimap that's being slow to consume them, but actually it's almost impossible to identify where the delay is coming from. If you're using a third-party service, some of them can be slow, and sometimes they might not be running, and sometimes it can be quite hard to identify whether they are running or not. But it's always worth taking them out and reloading them if you have problems with them. I think that's a really useful trick. The other thing I was going to add, Viv, about the OpenStreetMap data, the very detailed stuff you were looking at there in Tiananmen Square, you'll find that the level of detail does vary quite considerably across the world. It does depend, because it's a crowdsourced data set, it does depend very much where you're looking and how keen the local folks are to have their area mapped as to how much content there is there. You'll find that bigger cities are likely to be more densely mapped than rural areas. Certainly we've looked in some very remote areas of the world and there isn't much there. If anybody's on exciting trips and feels like adding to the OpenStreetMap dataset, then anybody can register and add their own stuff. So if you're on some exciting trek in the middle of nowhere, then do feel that you can add to the community knowledge on that place.
Thanks, Emma. Just to illustrate what Emma's saying, I just searched for Alaska and then I've zoomed in. I'm obviously not in Anchorage because I think Anchorage is quite well mapped, but because I've zoomed into this more remote area of Alaska, and I'm at the OpenStreetMap level of detail, there isn't anything there. So you will find, as Emma says, that in major cities, yep, things are extremely well mapped, lots of detail, but in more remote places, you can come across these white areas. So I think that's all I'll say about Global Roam. I'll give a very quick look at Global Download now. And if anyone's got any questions or if there's anything you want me to show again, just do say.
While you load that, Viv, I'll answer a question here that says, will there be a global WMS coming at any point, or is that available elsewhere? I think we did have a plan to produce a WMS feed through Digimap of the OpenStreetMap data, but I am aware that those things do already exist from elsewhere. So this is higher up the tree than my pay grade, but it's possible that we've made a decision not to do it because it's available elsewhere already. It's quite an effort to set a a WMS up, a secure WMS up, so that it works. And if these are already available elsewhere, then you may be as well to find alternatives. So certainly the OpenStreetMap Foundation website will be able to point you in the right direction of one that will work properly.
Okay, thank you. So this is the data download service. So I've just searched and zoomed into Leipzig. So the downloading data, there's several steps to the process. They go in sequence, it's pretty simple. So the first step is to select your area of interest, and there's a few tools to allow you to do that, but I'm just going to use the most simple one, which is just to draw a rectangle over the area I'm interested in. The next step is to just check the boxes next to the mapping products that you want. So for example, if I want OpenStreetMap, I would just tick that box. There's two different options here. If you're a CAD user, we have OpenStreetMap in DWG format. I've selected the one that provides it in a file geodatabase and geopackage format. And then you can open up any of the three categories if you're interested in natural earth, for example. There are vector and raster versions of the data. There's a lot of different options there at different scales. And then in Collins Bartholomew, again, you can choose in between two different projections. So I'll take that one. And once you've got those selected, just add to basket. And then depending on the product that you've requested, there are some different options. So for OpenStreetMap, I can select a different format. I can also select the layers that I want. So I'm not sure if Seraphim did this, but you could, for example, deselect all and just select roads, for example, if you didn't want all of the data. And then in the Collins World Panorama, you can select, we've got versions going back 3 years at present. And then it's just a matter of requesting the download, and you're given an email to confirm, and then an email when it's ready. So that's been a bit of a quick run through, but I hope that was useful. And yeah, happy to take any more questions or review any of that.
We have one more question, Viv. Would it be possible to devise a type of OCR that would collect street names from scanned paper maps? I believe this has already been is being done in various places. I think it's probably a fairly intense process, and I'm afraid I don't know much more about that. But I do know that it is possible, and I do know that certainly on small scale things, it has been done for particular projects. We'd have to dig around a bit more to find a bit more about that, I think.
I think that question was asked in our historic Digimap webinar.
Yes.
And I'm not sure if Rick, the presenter, I think he did reference something. So we can look into that and check with him
You're
again.
right, I'd forgotten that, Viv. Yes, you had. If we have no more questions then, I think it just remains for us to say thank you very much to Seraphim for his time and his energy and his fantastic presentation. Fascinating stuff. We're really delighted that people are prepared to put in a little bit of time for these things to share their research with people who are looking at the same data but for other reasons. It always helps to spark ideas. We're hugely grateful, and we'd love you to come and do another one for the next project if that's okay.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for all the support. I would like to thank you both and Digimap for the support, because I had obviously loads of questions that you have been very responsive to over the last couple of years in relation to this project. Thank you.
Good. We try. We are here. I know we're all working out of the office and so on, but we're still connected. We haven't gone away. Great. That's all for today then. Thank you everyone for joining us. We look forward to seeing you for the next one.